I can't do it anymore." 17-year-old Quincy Washington's anguished scream echoed through the backstage area of Atlanta's Rialto Theater as he sat hunched over a piano bench, his hands trembling above keys he could no longer see. Ray Charles had just finished his sound check when he heard the devastating cry from the practice room down the hall. What Ray discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about mentorship, talent, and what it really means to overcome the impossible. But to understand why this moment would transform two lives forever, you need to know about the accident that shattered a prodigy's dreams, and the decision Ray was about to make that would prove blindness isn't a limitation. It's a different way of seeing the world. The date was March 18, 1964, and Ray Charles was preparing for what would become one of his most memorable performances at Atlanta's historic Rialto Theater. The venue, known for hosting both established stars and emerging talent, had a small practice room backstage where musicians could warm up before shows. Ray had always made it a point to arrive early for sound checks, preferring to familiarize himself with each venue's unique acoustics. That afternoon, as Ray navigated the narrow backstage corridors with his white cane, he heard something that stopped him cold. The sound of someone playing piano drifted from the practice room, but it wasn't the melody that caught his attention, it was the emotion behind it. Whoever was playing had technical skill, but there was something broken in the music, something that spoke of loss and desperation. The music stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of hands slamming down on the keyboard. Then came the scream that would haunt Ray for days afterward. "I can't do it anymore." Ray pushed open the door to the practice room and stepped inside. "Son?" he called out gently. "You all right in here?" The voice that answered was young, male, and filled with shame. "I'm sorry, Mr. Charles. I didn't know you were here. I'll leave." "Hold on now," Ray said, moving closer to the piano. "I'm Ray, and I couldn't help but hear you playing. You've got some serious talent there." "Had talent," came the bitter reply. Past tense. Ray settled into a chair near the piano bench. "Mind telling me what that means?" That's when he learned about Quincy Washington, a 17-year-old who had been considered one of the most promising young pianists in Georgia before a drunk driver changed everything on a rainy night in November 1962. Quincy had been returning home from a recital at Atlanta's Symphony Hall, where he had just performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 to a standing ovation. The accident left him with multiple injuries, but the most devastating loss wasn't physical. It was the complete loss of his vision. "I was supposed to audition for Juilliard this spring," Quincy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had it all planned out, full scholarship probably. My teacher said I was conservatory material, that I could have a real career. But that was when I could see the keys." Ray listened without interrupting, recognizing something of his own story in Quincy's words. Ray had lost his sight to glaucoma at age 7, but he had been so young that he had grown up learning to navigate the world without vision. Quincy had lived 17 years with sight, had learned to read music visually, had watched his own hands as he played. The adjustment to blindness as a teenager, especially for someone whose entire identity was built around musical performance, would be exponentially more difficult. "Tell me about your playing before the accident," Ray said. For the first time, Quincy's voice showed a spark of its former enthusiasm. "I started when I was 4. My grandmother had an old upright piano, and I would climb up on the bench and just hit keys. But by the time I was 6, I was picking out melodies I'd heard on the radio. My parents got me lessons, and my teacher said I had perfect pitch." Ray nodded. "And after the accident, the enthusiasm disappeared immediately. I tried to keep playing at first. My parents converted our basement into a music room, bought me a new piano, but I kept making mistakes I never made before. I couldn't see the keys, couldn't read sheet music. Everything I'd spent 13 years learning felt useless." "What brought you here today?" Ray asked. Quincy was quiet for a long moment. "Dr. Helen Patterson. She's a vision rehabilitation specialist who's been working with me. She arranged for me to meet you, said maybe talking to another blind musician might help. But I knew it was pointless. Why's that? Because you lost your sight when you were a child. You learned to play blind. I learned to play sighted. And now I'm trying to relearn everything from scratch at 17. It's like trying to speak a foreign language when you've only ever known English. Ray understood the frustration, but he also heard something else in Quincy's voice, a deep, abiding love for music that hadn't been extinguished despite everything he'd been through. Play something for me, Ray said. I told you, I can't. I make too many mistakes. I didn't ask you to play perfectly. I asked you to play something. Reluctantly, Quincy turned toward the keyboard and began to play a simple Mozart sonata. His technique was indeed rusty, and he made several wrong notes, but Ray could hear the musical intelligence beneath the mistakes. More importantly, he could hear the emotion, the yearning, the frustration, the love for music that was still there despite everything. When Quincy finished, he immediately began apologizing for the errors. Ray held up a hand to stop him. Son, let me tell you something. I've been playing piano for most of my life, and I've never played a perfect performance. Not once. You know why? Quincy shook his head. Because perfect isn't the point. Music isn't about hitting every note exactly right. It's about communication. It's about taking what's in your heart and finding a way to share it with other people. And what I just heard from you, those emotions, that musical instinct, that's not something you can lose in an accident. But the mistakes can be fixed with practice. What you can't teach is what you already have. The ability to make people feel something when you play. That's a gift, Quincy. And gifts like that are rare, whether you concede or not. Ray spent the next hour working with Quincy, teaching him techniques he had developed for playing piano without sight. The key, Ray explained, is to stop thinking of blindness as a limitation and start thinking of it as a different way of experiencing music. What do you mean? When you could see, you relied on visual cues. You watched your hands, read sheet music with your eyes. But music isn't a visual art form. It's auditory. Now you get to experience it the way it's meant to be experienced, through sound and touch and feeling. Ray demonstrated by playing a section of Georgia on My Mind, his hands moving across the keys with the confidence that comes from decades of practice. I don't need to see the keys because I know where they are. I can feel the music through my fingertips, hear the harmony in my head before I play it. In some ways, losing my sight made me a better musician, because it forced me to develop my other senses. For the first time since Ray had met him, Quincy seemed genuinely interested. How long did it take you to adjust? I was lucky because I was so young, but even now, 30 years later, I'm still learning new ways to adapt. The difference is, I stopped seeing blindness as something that was happening to me, and started seeing it as part of who I am. Ray worked with Quincy for several more hours that day, teaching him finger exercises, designed to rebuild muscle memory, without visual cues. They worked on scales, basic chord progressions, and simple melodies. By the end of the session, Quincy was playing with noticeably more confidence. I want to show you something, Ray said as the session was winding down. He began to play an intricate jazz arrangement that incorporated elements of classical technique. This piece requires me to know exactly where every key is, to anticipate chord changes, to feel the rhythm in my body. I couldn't play it if I was depending on my eyes. When he finished, Quincy was quiet for several minutes. Finally he said, "Could you teach me to do that?" "I could teach you the techniques," Ray replied carefully. "But whether you can do it depends on how much you want it, and how hard you're willing to work." That conversation began what would become one of the most intensive mentorship relationships of Ray Charles' career. Over the next 3 weeks, Ray rearranged his touring schedule to spend time in Atlanta working with Quincy. They met every day for 4 to 6 hours, working on everything from basic finger placement to advanced jazz harmony. Dr. Helen Patterson observed many of these sessions, documenting techniques that would later be used to help other blind musicians adapt to their condition. What Ray was doing went far beyond music instruction, she later wrote in her professional journals. He was teaching Quincy to reimagine his relationship with his instrument, and by extension, with his disability. The breakthrough came during their second week of work together. Ray had been teaching Quincy to play by ear, to listen to a melody once and then reproduce it on the piano. It was a skill Ray had developed as a child, but for Quincy, who had learned to play primarily by reading sheet music, it was entirely new territory. "I'm going to play something," Ray said, "and I want you to listen. Don't worry about memorizing it or analyzing it. Just listen and feel." Ray played a beautiful melancholy piece that seemed to capture all the sadness and hope of Quincy's journey over the past year and a half. When he finished, he turned to Quincy and said, "Now you try." "I can't, I only heard it once." "You don't need to play it exactly the way I did. Play what you heard, what you felt." Quincy placed his hands on the keyboard and began to play. What came out wasn't an exact reproduction of Ray's piece, but it was something even better. It was Quincy's own interpretation, filtered through his own experience and emotions. The melody was similar, but the harmony was different, more complex. The rhythm was more urgent, reflecting Quincy's youth and his struggle to rebuild his identity. When he finished, both men sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Ray spoke. "Son, what you just did, taking something you heard and making it your own, that's not just playing music, that's being a musician." For Quincy, it was a revelation. "I felt it," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I could feel the music in my hands, in my body." It wasn't about the notes on the page, it was about the music itself. From that point forward, Quincy's progress accelerated dramatically. Ray introduced him to jazz improvisation, teaching him to think of the piano not as a set of predetermined keys, but as a voice for expressing whatever he was feeling in the moment. They worked on blues progressions, gospel chord changes, and classical techniques, always emphasizing the emotional content over technical perfection. "Music is a language," Ray explained during one of their sessions, "and like any language, the point isn't to speak it perfectly, it's to communicate something meaningful." As Quincy's confidence grew, so did his ambitions. The Juilliard audition, which had seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier, began to feel achievable. Ray helped him select pieces that would showcase his technical skills, while also demonstrating his unique musical voice. "Remember," Ray told him as the audition date approached, "they're not looking for someone who can play the notes exactly as written. They're looking for someone who can take those notes and turn them into music." The audition took place on a cold April morning at Juilliard's New York campus. Quincy's parents, Ruby and Franklin Washington, had made the trip to support their son, though they were almost as nervous as he was. Ray had wanted to be there, but was performing in Chicago that week. Instead, he called Quincy the night before to offer encouragement. "Just remember what we've worked on," Ray said over the phone. "Don't play for the judges, play for yourself, play for the music." The audition repertoire included a Bach prelude and fugue, a Chopin nocturne, and a piece of Quincy's own choosing. For his personal selection, Quincy had chosen to perform the piece Ray had played for him during their breakthrough session, but arranged in his own style. When Quincy walked into the audition room, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but also something he hadn't experienced since before his accident: genuine excitement about performing. He had spent so long thinking about what he couldn't do, that he had almost forgotten the joy he felt when making music. The Bach went well, his fingers moving confidently through the complex counterpoint. The Chopin was even better, his interpretation showing maturity and emotional depth that impressed the faculty panel. But it was his personal selection that truly showcased what he had learned from Ray. Instead of simply playing the melody as Ray had taught it to him, Quincy began with a simple statement of the theme, then built upon it with variations that drew from classical, jazz, and blues traditions. It was a performance that demonstrated not only technical skill, but also musical creativity and personal expression. When he finished, the room was silent for several seconds. Finally, one of the faculty members spoke. "Mr. Washington, that last piece, who wrote it?" Quincy smiled. "I did, sir, based on something my teacher showed me." 3 weeks later, Quincy received his acceptance letter to Juilliard, along with a full scholarship. But more than the academic achievement, what mattered to him was the feeling that he had reclaimed his identity as a musician. Ray Charles continued to mentor Quincy throughout his years at Juilliard, offering advice not just about music, but about navigating the professional world as a blind performer. Their relationship evolved from teacher and student to colleague and friend, based on mutual respect for each other's musical abilities. "Ray didn't just teach me how to play piano without sight," Quincy reflected years later. "He taught me that blindness didn't have to define me. It could be part of who I was as a musician, but it didn't have to limit who I could become." After graduating from Juilliard, Quincy went on to have a successful career as both a classical and jazz pianist. He performed with major orchestras, recorded several albums, and eventually became a teacher himself, specializing in working with disabled musicians. In 1975, 11 years after their first meeting, Quincy established the Ray Charles Foundation for Blind Musicians, which provides scholarships and training opportunities for visually impaired students pursuing musical careers. The foundation has since helped hundreds of musicians overcome the challenges associated with vision loss and pursue their artistic dreams. "Ray Charles changed my life by showing me that disability doesn't have to mean inability," Quincy said during the foundation's inaugural event. "He taught me that sometimes what seems like an obstacle can actually become an advantage if you're willing to change the way you think about it." Ray continued to support the foundation throughout his life, performing at fundraising concerts and mentoring young musicians who faced similar challenges to those he and Quincy had overcome. For Ray, the relationship with Quincy had been as transformative as it was for his student. "Working with Quincy reminded me why I became a musician in the first place," Ray said in a 1980 interview. "It's not about fame or money or even artistic achievement, it's about the pure joy of making music and sharing that joy with other people." The story of Ray Charles and Quincy Washington became a powerful example of how mentorship can transform lives on both sides of the relationship. Ray's willingness to invest time and energy in a struggling young musician not only saved Quincy's career but also reinforced Ray's own sense of purpose and connection to the musical community. Today, more than 50 years after that first desperate cry in the practice room of the Rialto Theater, the impact of their relationship continues to ripple through the music world. The techniques Ray developed for teaching blind musicians are still used in music schools around the country. The foundation Quincy established continues to provide opportunities for disabled artists, and the music they created together, both in those early practice sessions and in their later collaborations, serves as a testament to the power of human creativity to transcend any limitation. "Music doesn't care if you can see," Quincy often tells his own students. "Music cares if you can feel, if you can listen, if you can express something meaningful through sound. Everything else is just technique, and technique can always be learned." The practice room where Ray first discovered Quincy has been preserved as part of the Rialto Theater's historical renovation. A small plaque near the piano reads, "In this room, March 18, 1964, Ray Charles and Quincy Washington proved that the most important vision a musician can have is the ability to see possibility where others see limitation." For Ray Charles, the encounter with Quincy Washington represented something fundamental about his approach to both music and life. Throughout his career, Ray had faced countless obstacles: racism, poverty, addiction, and of course blindness. But he had learned that obstacles could become opportunities if approached with the right mindset and sufficient determination. "I've always believed that music is about more than entertainment," Ray reflected near the end of his life. "It's about connection, understanding, and proving that human beings can overcome anything if they have something they truly love and someone who believes in them." The relationship between Ray and Quincy also highlighted the importance of mentorship in the arts. Both men understood that talent alone isn't enough. Young artists need guidance, support, and most importantly, someone who can help them see their own potential when they can't see it themselves. "Ray didn't just teach me music," Quincy said during Ray's memorial service in 2004, "he taught me to believe in myself again. He showed me that losing my sight didn't mean losing my future. That's a gift that goes far beyond any song or technique or performance. That's a gift of hope." The legacy of their relationship continues through the countless musicians who have been inspired by their story, the students who have benefited from the foundation they created, and the ongoing work of music therapists and educators who understand that disability doesn't have to mean inability. In the end, the story of Ray Charles and Quincy Washington is about more than music. It's about the power of human connection to transform lives, the importance of seeing potential where others see only problems, and the truth that some of our greatest strengths can emerge from what we initially perceive as our greatest weaknesses. As Quincy continues to teach and perform well into his 70s, he often shares Ray's most important lesson with his students. Music isn't about perfection, it's about truth. And the truth is that every human being has something beautiful to offer the world, regardless of their limitations. The only question is whether they're brave enough to share it. The impact of Ray and Quincy's relationship extended far beyond their personal connection, fundamentally changing how the music industry approaches disability and accessibility. Before their collaboration became widely known, many music institutions had informal barriers that effectively excluded blind and visually impaired students. The assumption was that classical music, with its complex written notation and precise visual coordination requirements, was simply not accessible to those who couldn't see. Quincy's success at Juilliard challenged these assumptions directly. His professors were initially skeptical about how a blind student would handle the rigorous academic and performance requirements of a conservatory education. But Quincy's innovative approaches to learning and performing, many of which he had developed during his work with Ray, proved that traditional methods weren't the only path to musical excellence. Quincy forced us to reconsider our entire pedagogical approach, recalled Dr. Margaret Steinberg, who served as Quincy's primary piano instructor at Juilliard from 1964 to 1968. "We had to develop new techniques for teaching music theory, ear training, and performance skills to a student who couldn't rely on visual learning. In the process, we discovered that these techniques often benefited our sighted students as well." The teaching methods that Ray had improvised during those intensive weeks in Atlanta became the foundation for a comprehensive program that Juilliard implemented for students with visual impairments. The program included specialized notation systems, tactile learning techniques, and modified performance practices that allowed blind students to participate fully in ensemble work and solo performances. Other music schools across the country began adopting similar programs, often consulting with both Ray and Quincy about best practices. By 1970, more than 50 conservatories and music departments had established formal accommodations for students with visual impairments, directly inspired by Quincy's pioneering experience. The professional music world also began to change. Recording studios started hiring blind musicians not as novelty acts, but as serious artists whose unique perspective brought something valuable to musical collaborations. Concert halls modified their procedures to accommodate blind performers, installing tactile markers and improving acoustic design to help visually impaired musicians navigate performance spaces. Ray Charles himself became an unofficial spokesperson for accessibility in music, speaking at conferences and workshops about the importance of inclusive practices in the entertainment industry. His own success had always been a powerful example, but his articulate advocacy for other disabled musicians gave the movement intellectual and artistic credibility. Ray understood something that many people in the business didn't, explained Joe Adams, Ray's longtime manager and friend. Disability isn't a barrier to artistic excellence, it's just a different starting point. Some of the most innovative music comes from artists who have to find new ways to express themselves because the conventional methods don't work for them. This philosophy influenced Ray's later hiring practices as well. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, his touring bands and recording sessions regularly included musicians with various disabilities. Ray believed that diverse perspectives led to more interesting music, and his albums from this period reflected that diversity in their innovative arrangements and unconventional instrumental combinations. Quincy Washington, meanwhile, was building his own career while simultaneously developing the pedagogical approaches that would become his lasting contribution to music education. After graduating from Juilliard, he spent several years performing as a soloist with major orchestras, but he found that his true passion lay in teaching and mentoring other musicians who faced similar challenges. In 1972, Quincy joined the faculty at the New England Conservatory of Music, where he established the first formal degree program in adaptive music performance. The program was designed not just for blind musicians, but for students with any kind of physical or cognitive disability that required alternative approaches to musical learning and performance. The goal wasn't to create special accommodations, Quincy explained in a 1975 interview with Music Educator magazine. The goal was to develop teaching methods that were effective for all kinds of learners. A technique that helps a blind student understand harmonic progression might also help a sighted student who learns better through auditory processing than visual reading. The program attracted students from around the world, and its graduates went on to successful careers as performers, composers, and educators. Many of them credited Quincy's approach with not just teaching them musical skills, but with helping them develop the confidence and self-advocacy abilities necessary to succeed in a competitive industry. The research component of Quincy's work led to groundbreaking studies on the relationship between sensory processing and musical ability. Working with cognitive scientists and neurologists, he documented the ways that blind musicians develop enhanced auditory and tactile processing abilities, and how these enhanced abilities can actually provide advantages in certain types of musical performance. What we discovered, Quincy wrote in his 1978 book Beyond Sight: Alternative Approaches to Musical Excellence, is that the traditional model of music education was actually quite limiting, even for sighted students. By expanding our teaching methods to accommodate different types of learners, we opened up new possibilities for everyone. The book became required reading in music education programs across the country and was translated into 12 languages. It established Quincy as an international authority on adaptive music education and led to consulting opportunities with music schools, therapy programs, and performance organizations worldwide. Ray Charles continued to support Quincy's academic and research work throughout the 1970s and 1980s, often participating in studies and providing insights based on his own decades of experience as a blind professional musician. Their continued collaboration produced several influential papers on topics ranging from the development of perfect pitch in blind children to the use of music therapy and rehabilitation programs for newly blind adults. Working with Quincy kept me connected to the educational side of music in a way that I might not have been otherwise, Ray reflected in a 1985 interview. Touring and recording can become very insular, but seeing how our techniques were helping other musicians reminded me that music is ultimately about communication and community, not just individual expression. The Ray Charles Foundation for Blind Musicians, which Quincy established in 1975, became one of the most influential organizations in the field of disability and arts. Unlike many charitable foundations that focused on providing financial assistance, the Ray Charles Foundation emphasized education, mentorship, and professional development. The foundation's programs included summer intensive workshops, masterclasses with established blind musicians, career counseling and job placement services, and research grants for studies on adaptive music education. By 1990, the foundation had provided services to more than 2,000 musicians and had funded research projects at more than 50 universities and conservatories. One of the foundation's most successful initiatives was the Mentor Match program, which paired experienced blind musicians with younger artists who were just beginning their careers. The program was inspired directly by Ray and Quincy's relationship, and it sought to replicate the intensive personalized guidance that had been so crucial to Quincy's development. The most important thing Ray gave me wasn't musical technique. Quincy often told mentor participants, it was the belief that my disability didn't define my limitations. That's something you can't learn from a textbook or a workshop. It comes from seeing someone who looks like you, who faces the same challenges you face, living successfully and creating beautiful things. The mentor relationships formed through the program often lasted for decades, creating networks of support and collaboration that extended far beyond the formal structure of the foundation. Many participants went on to become mentors themselves, continuing the cycle of guidance and support that Ray and Quincy had started. As Ray aged and his health began to decline in the 1990s, his relationship with Quincy took on new dimensions. Quincy became not just a former student and colleague, but a trusted friend and advisor. Ray consulted with Quincy on major career decisions, relied on his insights about the changing music industry, and valued his perspective on both artistic and personal matters. Ray was getting older, and the music business was changing in ways that were sometimes difficult for him to navigate. Quincy recalled, but he remained curious about new developments, new technologies, new ways of thinking about music. He'd call me up and ask, "What do you think about this sampling stuff?" Or "How do you think digital recording is going to affect the way people make music?" He was always learning. Quincy was one of the few people Ray trusted to arrange his later performances for maximum accessibility, both for Ray himself and for audience members with disabilities. Concert venues were evaluated not just for their acoustic properties, but for their accessibility features. Ray insisted that his performances be welcoming to fans with all kinds of disabilities, and Quincy helped implement the practical measures necessary to make that vision a reality. When Ray Charles passed away in June 2004, Quincy was among the speakers at his memorial service. His eulogy focused not on Ray's fame or commercial success, but on his generosity as a teacher and mentor. Ray Charles changed my life by showing me that blindness was not the end of my dreams, but the beginning of a different kind of dreaming. Quincy told the assembled mourners. He taught me that limitations are often just opportunities in disguise, and that the most important vision any artist can have is the ability to see possibility where others see only problems. Following Ray's death, Quincy assumed a more prominent role in preserving and continuing Ray's educational legacy. He worked with Ray's estate to ensure that the Ray Charles Foundation would continue its work, and he took on additional responsibilities as a spokesperson for disability rights and accessibility in the arts. In 2005, Quincy published a second book, The Mentor's Gift: Lessons from Ray Charles about music, life, and possibility. The book combined memoir, educational philosophy, and practical guidance for musicians with disabilities. It became a bestseller and further established Quincy as a leading voice in discussions about disability and artistic achievement. "The most important thing I learned from Ray," Quincy wrote in the book's introduction, "is that being different isn't the same as being limited. Every challenge we face is also an opportunity to develop new strengths, new perspectives, new ways of approaching our art. The question isn't whether we can overcome our obstacle, it's whether we're willing to be transformed by them." Today, more than 20 years after Ray Charles's death, the impact of his relationship with Quincy Washington continues to influence music education, accessibility advocacy, and disability rights. The techniques they developed together are taught in music schools around the world. The foundation they created continues to support hundreds of musicians annually, and their example continues to inspire artists who face seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Ray and Quincy proved something that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary at the time, observes Dr. Sarah Mitchell, current director of the Ray Charles Foundation. They showed that excellence in music has nothing to do with conforming to conventional expectations and everything to do with finding your own authentic voice. That's a lesson that applies to all artists, whether they have disabilities or not. The practice room at Atlanta's Rialto Theater, where Ray first discovered Quincy, has been designated as a historic landmark and is preserved as part of the venue's educational programming. Music students regularly visit the room to learn about the history of adaptive music education and to understand how chance encounters can lead to transformative relationships. A bronze plaque mounted near the piano, where Quincy first played for Ray, bears an inscription that captures the essence of their relationship. In this room, March 18, 1964, a desperate cry became the beginning of a beautiful friendship that would change the world of music forever. Sometimes our greatest breakdowns become our most important breakthroughs. The story of Ray Charles and Quincy Washington reminds us that mentorship is one of the most powerful forces for positive change in the world. It demonstrates that when experienced artists take the time to guide and encourage emerging talents, the benefits extend far beyond the individuals involved. Entire communities, industries, and generations can be transformed by the generosity of those who are willing to share their knowledge and experience with others. For musicians today, particularly those who face challenges related to disability or other barriers to traditional success, the example of Ray and Quincy offers both practical guidance and profound inspiration. Their story proves that with the right support, innovative thinking, and unwavering determination, it's possible not just to overcome obstacles, but to transform them into sources of strength and creativity. As Quincy Washington continues his work well into his 8th decade, he remains committed to carrying forward the lessons Ray Charles taught him about music, mentorship, and the power of human potential. His students, his foundation, and his ongoing advocacy work serve as living testimonials to the truth that one person's willingness to help another can create ripple effects that last for generations. Ray saved my musical career, Quincy often concludes when telling their story. But more than that, he taught me how to save others. That's the real gift of mentorship. It doesn't end with the original relationship. It continues forward, creating new connections and new possibilities for everyone it touches.